There's a kind of tiredness that no amount of sleep can fix. You close your eyes for 8 hours. You wake up on time. You move through your morning like you're supposed to. But the moment your feet touch the floor, something already feels heavy. Not in your muscles, not in your bones, somewhere deeper. As if your inner world is carrying weight you never agreed to hold. This isn't exhaustion from a long day. This is what happens when you've been holding yourself together for far too long, without anyone noticing. And here's what makes it confusing. There's no single moment you can point to, no breakdown, just a slow accumulation of things you never said and needs you quietly abandoned so you could keep showing up for everyone else. In the next few minutes, we'll explore why this exhaustion runs so deep, what it's doing to your brain, and how healing becomes possible when you finally stop forcing yourself to be fine. When someone says they're tired of existing, most people hear something far more extreme than what's actually being said. They assume it means wanting to give up, wanting to disappear, wanting life to end. But for many people, that interpretation completely misses the point. Being tired of existing is not about wanting to stop living. It's about wanting the noise to stop. The constant pressure to perform, the endless comparison, the expectation to stay positive, productive, and emotionally available, even when every part of you feels stretched beyond capacity. This kind of fatigue isn't dramatic. It's quiet. It lives in the background of everyday life. You still show up. You still function. But inside, there's a growing wish for simplicity, for fewer demands, for a moment where you don't have to explain yourself or hold everything together. What makes this state especially painful is how misunderstood it is. When exhaustion gets mistaken for negativity or weakness, people learn to hide it. They minimize what they're feeling. They tell themselves they're being ungrateful. And slowly, the distance between their inner world and the outside world grows wider. So, if you've ever thought, I don't want to disappear, I just want this to be quieter, there's nothing wrong with you. That thought isn't a failure. It's a signal, and it deserves to be understood, not feared. Psychologists have a name for the state that often sits beneath this kind of fatigue. They call it emotional exhaustion. But despite how clinical that sounds, the experience itself is deeply human. Emotional exhaustion doesn't happen because you're weak. It happens because your emotional output has been greater than your emotional input for too long. For months, sometimes years. You keep giving your patience, your understanding, your effort, without receiving enough safety, rest, or support in return. You regulate yourself. You stay composed. You adapt, and at first, that works. But eventually, something in the mind changes. This is the moment when the system stops fighting. Not as a surrender, but as a form of conservation. Instead of pushing through stress, the mind begins to slow everything down. Motivation drops. Emotional responses flatten. Even things that once mattered start to feel distant. Not because you don't care, but because caring has become too expensive. It's important to understand what emotional exhaustion is not. It isn't laziness. It isn't a lack of ambition. And it isn't the same as depression, though it can look similar from the outside. Depression often carries a sense of hopelessness or self-criticism. Emotional exhaustion carries depletion. The energy simply isn't there. The fuel tank is empty. Not because the engine is broken, but because it's been running without refueling. From the outside, people in this state may still appear functional. They meet deadlines. They respond to messages. They smile when expected. But internally, there's a quiet shutdown happening. The mind isn't failing. It's protecting itself from further overload. And until that exhaustion is recognized for what it truly is, people keep trying to push through something that was never meant to be powered by force alone. This is what makes the experience so isolating. There's no obvious breakdown to point to, no dramatic failure. Just a growing sense that you're moving through life on autopilot. You're present in body, but absent in feeling. Joy doesn't disappear. It just becomes faint. Like a sound coming from another room, people in this state often describe it as living behind glass. You can see life happening. You can participate when necessary. But the emotional resonance isn't there anymore. Laughter feels delayed. Achievements feel strangely neutral. Even moments that should feel good don't quite land. This pattern shows up most often in people who've learned to be reliable. The helpers, the peacemakers, the ones who learned early that being functional was safer than being expressive, and because they're still functioning, their exhaustion often goes unnoticed by others, and eventually, by themselves. They tell themselves they shouldn't complain, that nothing is wrong enough to justify how empty they feel. So they keep going, assuming this muted version of life is just adulthood, or responsibility, or the price of being capable. But emptiness isn't a personality trait. It's a signal. A sign that something vital has been bypassed for too long. If this resonates with you, I'd love to hear from you. Type 1 in the comments if you've ever felt like you were just going through the motions. Type 2 if you've experienced that feeling of living behind glass. Your answer might help someone else feel less alone, but here's what most people never consider. This exhaustion isn't just emotional. It's biological. And what's happening inside your brain explains why everything you've tried so far hasn't worked. Under prolonged stress, the brain begins to change the way it functions. Not because something is going wrong, but because the system is trying to keep you alive. When stress becomes chronic, the brain shifts into survival mode. Instead of optimizing for curiosity, pleasure, or long-term meaning, it prioritizes conservation. Energy is treated as a limited resource. Anything that isn't essential gets reduced or shut down. This is where motivation starts to fade. The brain's reward system, particularly its dopamine responses, begins to slow. Dopamine isn't just about pleasure. It's what makes effort feel worthwhile. It's the spark behind anticipation, engagement, and momentum. When dopamine activity decreases, even small tasks can feel heavy. Goals that once mattered lose their pull. That's why rest alone often doesn't fix this kind of fatigue. You can take a day off, sleep in, go on vacation, and still feel flat. The issue isn't a lack of downtime. It's that your nervous system hasn't learned that it's safe to stand down. In this state, the brain becomes cautious with joy. Reaching for pleasure takes energy. Hoping takes energy. And when energy has been scarce for a long time, the brain learns to expect less. Not out of pessimism, but out of protection. Expecting nothing hurts less than being disappointed again. This is also why quick dopamine hits don't restore you. Endless scrolling, mindless entertainment, constant stimulation. They provide momentary distraction, not repair. The system stays activated, never fully settling. The most important thing to understand is this: your brain isn't broken, it's adapting. The numbness, the low motivation, the emotional flattening, they're signals of a system that has been carrying too much for too long. And systems in survival don't need pressure. They need safety, but there's something else happening here. Something that goes even deeper than brain chemistry. And it often traces back further than most people realize. There's a painful irony at the center of emotional exhaustion that rarely gets acknowledged. The people who feel the most depleted are often not the weakest ones in the room. They're the ones who've been strong for the longest. These are the people who learned early how to hold things together. They became reliable before they were ready, attuned before they were protected, useful before they were understood. Often, this strength wasn't a choice. It was a role. For many, this pattern started long before adulthood. Maybe you were the child who noticed when a parent was upset before they said a word. The one who learned to read the room before you learned to read books. The one who figured out that keeping the peace was more important than expressing how you felt. Back then, it kept you safe. It helped you navigate a world that felt unpredictable. But the nervous system doesn't forget. It carries that programming into every relationship, every job, every quiet moment where you still feel like you need to earn the right to rest. The child who sensed tension and tried to soften it. The one who stayed calm so others wouldn't fall apart. The one who learned that being easy was safer than having needs. Over time, that role hardened into an identity. Being capable became how they survived. As adults, these people are often praised. They're dependable, thoughtful, emotionally intelligent. They're the ones others lean on. The helpers, the peacemakers, the ones who notice what everyone else needs before anyone asks. But what rarely gets seen is the cost. Strength, when it's practiced without relief, becomes isolation. When you're always the steady one, there's no obvious place to put your own fear, grief, or exhaustion. You learn to manage discomfort internally, to self-regulate, to keep going, until regulation turns into suppression. And suppression is exhausting. What makes this pattern especially cruel is that it often looks like resilience. From the outside, it appears admirable. From the inside, it feels like never being allowed to stop. Never being allowed to fall apart. Never being allowed to say, "I can't do this anymore," without feeling like you're betraying who you're supposed to be. So when these individuals finally feel tired of existing, it isn't because they didn't try. It's because they tried too hard, for too long, without enough support. Their exhaustion isn't a character flaw. It's evidence of endurance, and the work at this stage isn't learning how to be stronger. It's learning how to let strength soften, so it no longer has to come at the cost of being human. And there's something even more insidious at play here. Something that keeps this exhaustion locked in place. There's a reason so many exhausted people feel ashamed of their exhaustion. It isn't just personal, it's cultural. We live in a system that quietly teaches us that movement equals worth, that being busy means being valuable, and that slowing down is something you're only allowed to do once you've earned it. This is how rest guilt forms. Even when the body is exhausted, the mind keeps whispering, "You should be doing more." Taking a break feels irresponsible. Sitting still feels indulgent. And choosing not to optimize every moment triggers anxiety, as if falling behind is a moral failure rather than a human limit. What makes this especially damaging is that guilt doesn't restore energy. It drains it further. People don't just feel tired, they feel bad for being tired. So instead of listening to exhaustion, they override it. They push harder. They tell themselves they'll rest later, but later never comes. Here's the paradox. The culture that praises endurance is often the same culture that quietly burns people out. It celebrates output, not well-being. Achievement, not alignment. So when rest feels uncomfortable, it's not because you're doing it wrong. It's because you're stepping outside a system that trained you to equate your value with your exhaustion. As emotional exhaustion deepens, many people begin to notice a quiet but unsettling shift. Things that once brought pleasure no longer do. Music sounds flat. Conversations feel effortful. Even moments that should feel comforting land with a dull neutrality. Psychology calls this anhedonia, the reduced ability to feel pleasure. Anhedonia isn't the same as sadness. Sadness still feels. Anhedonia feels like the absence of feeling. This state often leads to withdrawal. Plans get cancelled. Messages go unanswered. Social energy becomes scarce. Not because people don't care, but because every interaction requires emotional output their system no longer has. Even small talk can feel like lifting something far heavier than it looks. From the outside, this withdrawal is often misunderstood. It can look like avoidance, disinterest, apathy. But internally, yet, it's closer to self-protection. When the nervous system is overloaded, reducing stimulation becomes a way to prevent further depletion. It's important to understand this. People in this state aren't pushing others away to be cold. They're creating space to survive. Connection hasn't disappeared. It's just become too expensive. This is why well-meaning pressure can backfire. Being told to open up, go out more, or just try harder can feel like another demand on an already overdrawn system. What helps isn't forcing reconnection. It's restoring safety. When withdrawal is seen not as a flaw but as a signal, shame begins to loosen its grip. And in that space where there is less pressure to perform, the capacity for feeling can slowly return. Not through force, but through gentleness. Beyond emotional and physical exhaustion, there's another layer of fatigue that's harder to name, but often heavier than all the rest. It's the exhaustion that comes from living without a felt sense of meaning, not because life is falling apart, but because it no longer feels directed. This is what psychologists often describe as meaning fatigue. On the surface, things may look stable. There's routine, there's structure, there may even be comfort. But internally, days begin to blur together. Wake up, work, scroll, sleep, repeat. Life starts to feel like maintenance rather than movement. When this happens, people often begin asking questions that scare them. What's the point? Why am I doing this? Is this really all there is? These questions are frequently mistaken for negativity or ingratitude, but they're neither. They're signals. When the mind asks, but what's the point? It isn't giving up. It's searching for a reason to stay engaged. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl observed that humans can endure immense hardship when they have a why. But that why doesn't have to be grand or heroic. It doesn't have to impress anyone. It simply has to be real. Meaning fatigue sets in when your daily actions no longer reflect your values. When you're living a version of life that once made sense, but no longer fits who you've become. The exhaustion that follows isn't a failure of gratitude. It's a misalignment. And misalignment is draining. The important shift comes when you stop treating this fatigue as something to suppress and start listening to what it's pointing toward. Because meaning doesn't disappear without reason. It fades when it's asking to be rebuilt. On your terms, not someone else's. If this idea of meaning fatigue resonates with you, I'd love to know. What does your daily routine feel like right now? Drop a word in the comments. Whether you're watching from the US, Canada, Philippines, or Australia, this experience connects us across borders. What if this exhaustion isn't something to overcome, but something to listen to? So much of modern life teaches us to treat fatigue as an obstacle. Something to push through. Something to silence with discipline, distraction, or more effort. But the kind of tiredness we've been talking about doesn't respond to force. It responds to attention, because beneath it, there's a message. Fatigue often shows up when a version of life no longer fits who you are. When your days are shaped more by expectation than by truth. When your energy is spent surviving roles you've outgrown instead of living in alignment with what matters to you now. Listening doesn't mean quitting everything or making dramatic changes overnight. It means paying attention to where you feel tense, numb, or resentful, and where you feel even a small sense of ease. That's where alignment lives. That's where energy slowly returns. Not because life becomes perfect, but because it becomes real. When your actions reflect your values, effort feels lighter. When they don't, even simple tasks feel unbearable. The body follows the soul. This way of living is quieter, slower, less performative. It values rest as repair, not reward. Presence over productivity, psyched, meaning over momentum. And if you're here, listening to this, there's a good chance something in you already knows that a different way is possible. You're not broken. You're not weak. You're not asking for too much. You're simply a human being who has been running on empty for longer than anyone should have to. And the path forward doesn't require you to be stronger. It requires you to be softer. To finally give yourself permission to stop proving your worth through exhaustion. To let yourself be seen not just for what you do, but for who you are when you're not doing anything at all. Healing begins the moment you stop treating your fatigue as a flaw and start treating it as a message. A message that says, oh, it's time. Time to rebuild. Time to rest. Time to become someone who is allowed to simply exist. Without earning it first, if this video helped you feel seen, understood, or less alone, consider subscribing. This is a space for the quieter experiences people rarely talk about, but deeply recognize. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment below. What part of this exhaustion feels most familiar to you right now? You don't have to have answers. Being honest is enough to begin.